When Elijah discovered that freedom could be purchased for exactly $800, he made a calculation that would define the rest of his life. 20 hours of work every single day for 3 years, leaving only 4 hours for sleep, would be the price he'd pay to own himself. Before we dive into Elijah's extraordinary journey of sacrifice and determination, make sure to hit that bell icon and subscribe to this channel to follow more powerful stories like this one. Stories that illuminate the unbreakable human spirit and the ancestors who paid the ultimate price for the freedom we cherish today. The autumn sun hung low over the tobacco fields of Thornhill Plantation in North Carolina, casting long shadows across the rows where Elijah worked in 1851. At 26 years old, his hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had known labor since childhood. But his mind was occupied with numbers, always numbers. He had been calculating for weeks now, ever since Master Thornhill had made an unprecedented announcement. Any enslaved person on his plantation could purchase their freedom for $800. It was an astronomical sum, more money than most enslaved people would see in a lifetime. But Thornhill was a businessman above all else, and he had discovered that offering this option actually increased productivity. Most people saw it as an impossible dream, but Elijah saw it as a mathematical problem that could be solved. $800. I make nothing from my regular work, but Master Thornhill allows us to hire ourselves out on Sundays and after dark. If I can earn $5 a week, that's $260 a year. 3 years. 3 years of every waking moment dedicated to this single goal. The other enslaved people thought Elijah was dreaming an impossible dream, but his friend Josiah, who worked alongside him in the fields, saw the fierce determination in his eyes. "You serious about this, Elijah?" Josiah asked one evening as they walked back from the fields, their bodies aching from 14 hours of labor under the relentless sun. "About buying yourself?" Elijah nodded, his jaw set. "More serious than I've ever been about anything in my life. I've been enslaved since birth, Josiah. My mama was sold south when I was 7. My sisters scattered to 3 different plantations before they turned 12. I got no family left here, nothing keeping me but these chains. If Master Thornhill says I can buy my way out, then I'm buying my way out." Josiah was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what that means, don't you? Working yourself near to death. You already work sunup to sundown in these fields. Where you gonna find extra hours?" "I'll find them," Elijah said simply. "I'll work after dark. I'll work Sundays. I'll work every moment I'm not in these fields. I'll hire myself out to anyone who'll pay me. Other plantations, town folks, merchants, anyone. 3 years, Josiah. I can do anything for 3 years if freedom is waiting at the end." What Josiah didn't fully understand yet was that Elijah had already begun implementing his plan with the precision of a master strategist. For the past month, Elijah had been approaching neighboring plantation owners, offering his skills as a carpenter, skills his father had taught him before being sold away. He had also approached merchants in town, offering to load and unload their goods in the hours after sunset. He had even secured an agreement with a blacksmith named Mr. Carson, a free black man who owned his own shop, to work as his assistant on Sunday afternoons. Each commitment meant less sleep, less rest, less time for his body to recover from the brutal labor of tobacco farming. But Elijah had made his calculation and accepted the cost. He had created a careful schedule: wake at 4 in the morning, work the tobacco fields from 5 until 7 in the evening, grab a quick meal of cornbread and fatback, then head to whichever evening work he had secured, sometimes carpentry repairs that lasted until midnight, sometimes loading goods at the town warehouse until 2 in the morning, then back to his cabin for perhaps 3 or 4 hours of sleep before starting again. Sundays, instead of rest, meant a full day of blacksmithing work with Mr. Carson. It was a punishing schedule that would break most men within weeks. But Elijah was not most men, and he had a secret weapon that went beyond mere physical endurance. He had his mother's voice in his head, words she had spoken to him the last time he saw her. "Baby," she had said, gripping his 7-year-old hands with fierce intensity as the slave trader's wagon waited to take her away. "You remember this? Our people survived the Middle Passage, survived being torn from Africa, survived things that should have killed us all. We survive because we're stronger than they know, smarter than they think, and more determined than they can imagine. You got that strength in you, Elijah. Whatever comes, you survive, you endure, and you find your way to freedom. Promise me." He had promised, and now, 19 years later, he was making good on that promise. The first week of his new schedule nearly killed him. His body, already exhausted from field work, rebelled against the additional labor. His hands developed new blisters on top of old calluses. His back screamed with pain. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. But every night before collapsing onto his thin pallet, Elijah would pull out a small tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard and count the coins inside. After the first week, $2.50. After the second week, $5. After the first month, $22. $778 to go. 3 months into his plan, word began to spread among the enslaved community about what Elijah was attempting, and reactions were mixed. Some, like Josiah, were quietly supportive, occasionally slipping him an extra piece of cornbread or covering for him when exhaustion made him slower in the fields. Others were skeptical, convinced that Master Thornhill would find some excuse to deny him freedom even if he raised the full amount. A few were even resentful, feeling that Elijah's effort to buy himself represented a kind of collaboration with the system that oppressed them all. An older woman named Sarah, who had been enslaved on Thornhill Plantation for over 40 years, pulled Elijah aside one evening. "Boy, you killing yourself for a dream," she said, her weathered face showing genuine concern. "Even if you get that money, what make you think he gonna honor his word? Master Thornhill a businessman, you say? Businessman don't let valuable property walk away." Elijah met her gaze steadily. "Maybe you right, Aunt Sarah. Maybe he won't honor his word. But I know for certain I'll never be free if I don't try. I'd rather die trying than live my whole life wondering what if." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded, recognizing something in him that transcended mere hope. It was will, pure and undiluted. The work continued, relentless and exhausting. Elijah's typical day became a blur of motion and purpose. Rise before dawn, work the tobacco fields through the scorching heat and the autumn rains, and eventually the bitter cold of winter, then transition immediately to whatever evening work he had secured. Some nights it was carpentry, repairing furniture or building additions to homes for white families in town who paid him $1 or $2 for work that would have cost them 5 times that if done by a white carpenter. Other nights it was hauling goods at the warehouse, loading heavy barrels and crates onto wagons until his muscles quaked and threatened to give out entirely. Sundays meant 12 hours at Mr. Carson's blacksmith shop, where Elijah learned to work iron and steel, creating tools and horseshoes and wagon fittings. Mr. Carson, who had purchased his own freedom 15 years earlier, understood exactly what Elijah was attempting. "You got the fire in you, son," Carson said one Sunday as they worked side by side at the forge. "I recognize it because I had it too. But let me tell you something. Getting the money is only half the battle. You got to protect it, got to make sure nobody can take it from you, and got to have a plan for the day you walk away free." Carson's words proved prophetic, because at the 6-month mark, Elijah encountered his first major obstacle when word of his earnings reached the wrong ears. Marcus Thornhill, Master Thornhill's eldest son, was a cruel young man of 22 who resented his father's relatively lenient policies regarding enslaved people. When Marcus learned that Elijah was accumulating significant money, He approached his father with a proposal: increase Elijah's work requirements on the plantation, making it impossible for him to work the extra hours that generated his income. "Father, you're allowing this nigger to enrich himself while our tobacco crop could benefit from his extended labor," Marcus argued during a dinner conversation that Elijah would later hear about from Clara, a woman who worked in the main house. "Make him work longer hours here. We own him. We should have all his productive time." Master Thornhill, to his credit, refused. "I gave my word, Marcus. Any man on this plantation who can raise $800 may purchase his freedom. If I break that promise, I lose all credibility with my labor force." Elijah's extra work doesn't interfere with his plantation duties. In fact, his productivity in the fields has increased, probably because he's motivated. But Marcus didn't give up easily. Over the following weeks, he began finding excuses to discipline Elijah, claiming his work was subpar, discovering infractions of plantation rules, and generally making his life more difficult. It was a calculated campaign of harassment designed to break Elijah's spirit, or at least slow his progress. Elijah responded not with confrontation, but with even greater determination, adding another hour to his already impossible schedule to make up for the time Marcus's harassments cost him. The harassment reached a peak one cold January morning when Marcus inspected Elijah's cabin while he was in the fields and claimed to have found stolen property, a silver spoon that Marcus had clearly planted himself. The penalty for theft was whipping, which would lay Elijah up for days and destroy his ability to work his extra jobs. But Clara, the house servant who had warned Elijah about Marcus's intentions, came forward with testimony that she had seen Marcus enter Elijah's cabin with the spoon in his pocket. Master Thornhill, furious at his son's obvious deception, dismissed the charges and confined Marcus to the main house for 2 weeks. The incident taught Elijah a crucial lesson. He couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, needed people watching his back, needed the community's support. From that point forward, Elijah made a conscious effort to share his journey with others, not hoarding his goal, but making it a collective dream. When he earned extra money, he would occasionally use a portion to purchase small comforts, a bit of sugar, a piece of fabric, some tobacco, for others in the enslaved community. He helped repair cabins without charge, taught carpentry skills to young boys who wanted to learn, and generally positioned himself as someone whose success would benefit the whole community. The strategy worked. People began actively protecting Elijah's interests, covering for him when exhaustion made him stumble, warning him of potential dangers, and even finding him additional work opportunities. By the end of his first year, Elijah had saved $280, more than his initial calculation had projected, thanks to the community support and his own relentless effort. He allowed himself a moment of celebration, sitting in his cabin on Christmas night with Josiah and a few others, the tin box open on the table between them, the coins representing not just money, but possibility, hope, and the first tangible proof that his impossible dream might actually be achievable. $520 more, Elijah said, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. 2 more years at this pace, maybe less if I can find more work. Josiah shook his head in wonder. Man, I don't know how you still standing. You sleep more than 3 hours a night. Some nights 4, Elijah said with a slight smile. But sleep is temporary. Freedom is forever. An older man named Abraham, who had watched Elijah's progress with initial skepticism but growing respect, spoke up. I've been enslaved for 62 years, Elijah. Seen a lot of men talk about freedom, dream about it, even try to run for it. But I ain't never seen nobody buy their way to it, you actually doing it. You're showing us something we didn't think was possible. The weight of Abraham's words settled over the group like a benediction, and Elijah felt the responsibility of what he represented, not just his own freedom, but a pathway, a possibility, a proof of concept that others might follow. The second year proved even harder than the first because Elijah's body was beginning to break down under the impossible workload. He developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, likely from working in the cold night air after sweating in the fields all day. His joints ached constantly, especially his knees and back. He lost weight despite eating whenever he could, his body consuming itself to fuel the relentless labor. His hands became so calloused that he could barely feel the tools he worked with, and several of his fingers had been broken and healed crooked from accidents caused by exhaustion. But he pushed on, driven by a vision of freedom that grew more vivid with each dollar added to his tin box. He began dreaming of what he would do once free, maybe buy a small piece of land, maybe open his own carpentry shop, maybe even earn enough to try to buy his mother's freedom if he could locate her. These dreams sustained him through the darkest moments, when his body screamed for rest, and his mind suggested that perhaps Sarah had been right, that he was killing himself for an impossible dream. During the second year, Elijah also faced a different kind of challenge. Romantic interest from a woman named Hannah who worked in the plantation kitchen. Hannah was beautiful, intelligent, and kind, and she made it clear that she cared for Elijah deeply. But Elijah knew that forming attachments now would complicate everything. If he fell in love, he would want to buy Hannah's freedom too, which would double his required savings. If they had children, the calculation would become impossible. So Elijah made the painful decision to keep Hannah at a distance, not because he didn't care for her, but because he cared too much to give her false hope about a future together. "I can't think about love right now, Hannah," he told her gently one Sunday evening when she had sought him out. "My whole mind, my whole heart, is focused on one thing. If I divide my attention, I'll fail at everything." Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded with understanding. "I know. I just wanted you to know that someone sees you, Elijah. Sees what you're doing, sees the sacrifice, sees the strength it takes. When you free, you gonna make some woman very happy someday." After she left, Elijah sat in the darkness outside his cabin and wept for the first time since beginning his journey. The cost of freedom, he was learning, wasn't just measured in dollars and physical exhaustion. It was measured in lost moments, abandoned possibilities, and relationships that could never be. But he had made his choice, and he would see it through. 18 months down, 18 months to go. $490 saved. $310 remaining. By the middle of the second year, Elijah's reputation as an exceptional worker had spread throughout the county, and he found himself with more work opportunities than he could physically handle. White families competed for his carpentry services, merchants specifically requested him for loading jobs, and Mr. Carson had offered him a permanent position as a blacksmith once he achieved freedom. The second year's Christmas found Elijah with $540 in his tin box, more than 2/3 of the way to his goal. The momentum was building, and something had shifted in the community's perception of his quest. What had started as one man's impossible dream had become a symbol of hope for the entire enslaved population of Thornhill Plantation. People began bringing him small amounts of money, a few pennies here, a nickel there, contributed from their own meager earnings. "This for your freedom fund," they would say. "When you get free, you carrying a piece of all of us with you." Elijah was deeply moved by these contributions, understanding that people were giving from poverty to support his journey. He kept careful records of every donation in a small notebook that Mr. Carson had given him, vowing that once free, he would find ways to repay every person who had believed in him. The third year began with a crisis that nearly destroyed everything Elijah had worked for. In February, Master Thornhill suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to manage the plantation. Marcus Thornhill immediately assumed control, and his first act was to announce that his father's promise regarding purchased freedom was no longer valid. "My father made foolish concessions when he was healthy," Marcus declared during a plantation meeting. Under my management, there will be no more of this purchasing freedom nonsense. You are all property of Thornhill Plantation, and property you shall remain." The announcement hit Elijah like a physical blow, stopping his heart for a moment as the implications crashed over him. 2 years of killing himself, $540 saved, and now it meant nothing. That night, Elijah sat in his cabin, staring at the tin box, feeling the fragility of hope. "This is what Aunt Sarah warned me about," he thought bitterly. "They never intended to honor it. It was all a lie to squeeze more productivity out of us." But as he sat there, something hardened inside him. Not resignation, but determination of a different kind. He had not sacrificed 2 years of his life to give up now. If Marcus wouldn't honor the agreement, then Elijah would find another way. The next day, Elijah did something that could have gotten him killed. He went to see a lawyer in town, a man named Theodore Fletcher, who had a reputation for occasionally taking cases involving free black people. Walking into a white lawyer's office as an enslaved man was audacious, bordering on suicidal. But Elijah had learned over 2 years that the boldest moves sometimes succeeded precisely because they were unexpected. Fletcher listened to Elijah's story with growing interest. "You have $540 saved?" the lawyer asked. "And you have witnesses who can testify to the original agreement?" "Yes, sir. Multiple witnesses, including several white folks who heard Master Thornhill make the promise." Fletcher leaned back in his chair, studying Elijah with sharp eyes. "You're an unusual man, Elijah. Most in your position would have simply given up or run away. Why are you fighting this legally?" "Because I want to be free the right way, sir," Elijah explained, his voice steady despite the risk he was taking. "I want papers that say I bought myself, paid every dollar, earned my freedom honestly. That way, nobody can ever claim I'm a runaway or that I stole myself. I'll be legally free, and that paper will be my shield for the rest of my life." Fletcher nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in Elijah's reasoning. "I'll take your case. But understand, suing a white plantation owner to enforce a verbal contract with an enslaved person is unprecedented in this county. We might lose, and if we do, you could face severe punishment." "I understand the risk, sir, but doing nothing guarantees I stay enslaved forever. Trying gives me at least a chance." Over the next 3 months, Fletcher built a case around Master Thornhill's original promise, gathering testimony from enslaved people and white witnesses alike who had heard the offer. He also made a strategic decision to approach Master Thornhill directly, bypassing Marcus. The old man, still recovering from his stroke but mentally sharp, was furious when he learned his son had reneged on the promise. From his sickbed, Master Thornhill dictated a legal document affirming that Elijah could purchase his freedom for $800 and ordering Marcus to honor the agreement. Marcus was enraged, but he was also shrewd enough to understand that defying his father's explicit written order would damage his own legal standing in the community. However, Marcus found a way to make his compliance as difficult as possible, demanding that Elijah present the full $800 in a single payment, no partial payments accepted, and that the money be delivered within 30 days. This ultimatum created a crisis, because Elijah had $540 but still needed $260 more, and he had been planning to accumulate that gradually over the remaining months. Suddenly, his timeline had collapsed from 10 months to 1 month, an impossible acceleration. That evening, the enslaved community held an emergency meeting in the clearing behind the cabins. Josiah stood up first. "We've been saving our pennies and nickels to help Elijah," he said. "Time to see how much we got together." People came forward with their tiny contributions, coins wrapped in cloth, bills folded small, the accumulated savings of dozens of people who had almost nothing but were willing to give it to see one of their own go free. In total, they raised $73. It was a fortune by their standards, a profound sacrifice, but it still left Elijah $187 short, with 28 days remaining. Elijah stood before the group, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't have words to thank you," he managed to say. "Every penny you giving me represents food you won't eat, clothes you won't buy, comfort you won't have. I promise you, on my life, that when I'm free, I will dedicate myself to helping others follow this same path." The next morning, Elijah approached Mr. Carson with a proposal. He would work 24 hours a day for the next month, sleeping only in brief intervals, if Carson would advance him the remaining money against future labor. Carson studied him seriously. "Elijah, working 24 hours a day will kill you. You already working yourself to the bone at 20 hours. You can't sustain more." "I only need to sustain it for 1 month," Elijah countered. "1 month, and I'm free. I can rest when I'm free. Right now I need that money." Carson was quiet for a long time, then finally nodded. "I can advance you $100 against future work. But Elijah, you listening to me? You work yourself to death before getting free. It don't mean nothing. You got to survive this." "I will," Elijah promised, though he wasn't at all certain. The final month became a blur of exhaustion so profound that Elijah later remembered it only in fragments, like images from a fever dream. He would work the tobacco fields during the day, his movements mechanical, his mind barely conscious. The moment the evening bell rang, he would run, literally run, to town to begin whatever carpentry work he had scheduled, working by lamplight until midnight or beyond. Then he would head to the docks where goods arrived day and night, loading ships and wagons until dawn began to break. He would allow himself perhaps an hour of sleep, sometimes sitting up because lying down made it too hard to wake, then drag himself back to the plantation fields to start again. His body began to fail in various ways. His hands shook constantly. His vision blurred. He developed nosebleeds from exhaustion. He fainted twice while working, once falling from a ladder and miraculously escaping serious injury. But the money accumulated with desperate speed because Elijah had abandoned all caution, taking every job offered, working at a pace that was literally unsustainable, but which he only needed to sustain for a few more weeks. Hannah, despite Elijah's earlier rejection of her romantic interest, became his unexpected savior during this final month, bringing him food and forcing him to eat when he was too tired to remember, waking him when he needed to get to the next job, and generally keeping him alive through sheer force of will. "You're going to make it, Elijah," she would whisper when he was so exhausted he could barely stand. "Just a little longer. You're going to be free." With 1 week remaining, Elijah had $770. With 3 days remaining, he had $790. On the final day, he was still $10 short, and his body was shutting down. He had gone nearly 72 hours without real sleep, sustained only by will and the promise of freedom. That last day, Elijah took a job he would never have considered in other circumstances, cleaning out a wealthy family's horse stables, mucking out stalls in waste up to his knees, doing work that even enslaved people considered degrading. But it paid $5, and he didn't have pride left to spare. As the sun set on that final day, Elijah had $795. He was $5 short, and there were no more hours left to work. He sat in his cabin, his body trembling with exhaustion, staring at the money spread out before him on his bed, so close to his goal but still short. Then Josiah appeared at his door, his face somber. "I sold my Sunday shoes," Josiah said quietly, pressing $5 into Elijah's shaking hands. "They was the only thing of value I owned. You was willing to work yourself to death for freedom, Elijah. Least I can do is walk barefoot." Elijah looked at the $5, then at his friend's face, and for the second time on this journey, he wept. Not from despair, but from the overwhelming realization of what community meant, what sacrifice looked like, what love could accomplish. The next morning, Elijah walked into the main house of Thornhill Plantation, carrying a canvas bag that contained $800 in various denominations. Coins and bills representing 3 years of killing labor, the sacrifices of dozens of people, and the gradual death of his youth exchanged for the promise of freedom. Marcus Thornhill sat behind his father's desk, a cruel smile playing on his lips, clearly expecting Elijah to fail. "You have the full amount?" Marcus asked, his tone making it clear he doubted it. "In a single payment?" "Yes, sir." Elijah upended the bag on the desk, and $800 in carefully counted currency spilled out. Marcus's smile faded. He spent the next hour counting and recounting the money, clearly hoping to find a shortage, any excuse to deny Elijah's freedom. But the count came up correct every time, $800 exactly. Finally, with visible reluctance, Marcus produced a pre-written bill of sale that legally transferred ownership of Elijah from Thornhill Plantation to himself. Essentially, Elijah was purchasing himself. The document was signed, witnessed by Theodore Fletcher, who had been waiting outside, and registered with the county clerk that same day. When Elijah walked out of the courthouse, he held in his hands a piece of paper that changed his legal status from property to person, from enslaved to free. The community gathered that evening to celebrate, but Elijah was barely conscious, his body finally giving in to 3 years of accumulated exhaustion. He slept for nearly 36 hours straight, and when he woke, the first thought in his mind was not relief, but something more complex. "I'm free, but they're not. My freedom is just the beginning." Elijah spent the next several months recovering his health, working for Mr. Carson as a blacksmith, and slowly rebuilding the strength his 3-year ordeal had depleted. But even as his body healed, his mind was occupied with a new calculation. He had proven that freedom could be purchased. Now he needed to create a system that would allow others to follow his path. He established what he called the Freedom Fund, a collective savings pool where multiple enslaved people could contribute small amounts toward a rotating goal of purchasing freedom for one person at a time. The first person freed through this fund was Josiah, whose sacrifice of his shoes had made Elijah's freedom possible. The second was Hannah, who had kept Elijah alive during the final impossible month. Over the next 5 years, before the Civil War made such purchases unnecessary, Elijah's Freedom Fund helped 23 people buy their way out of slavery. But Elijah's greatest contribution wasn't the fund itself. It was the model he had created, the proof that the impossible could be calculated, planned, and achieved through combination of individual determination and community support. His story spread throughout North Carolina and into neighboring states, inspiring other enslaved people to attempt similar paths and forcing some plantation owners to honor purchase agreements they might otherwise have ignored. 15 years after purchasing his freedom, Elijah had become a successful blacksmith and property owner, married to a formerly enslaved woman named Ruth, and father to 3 children who were born free. He had located his mother, who had been sold to a plantation in Georgia, and purchased her freedom when he was 35 years old. That reunion, the moment he told her he had kept his childhood promise, that he had found his way to freedom just as she had demanded, was the proudest moment of his life. He never forgot the price of his freedom. 3 years of 20-hour days, the sacrifice of his youth and health, the contributions of a community that had nothing but gave anyway, and the grace of people like Josiah who gave their most precious possessions so another could be free. When the Civil War finally came and emancipation was declared, Elijah was 40 years old, and he stood among the formerly enslaved people celebrating in the streets. But his celebration was tinged with a complex understanding. Freedom granted was precious, but freedom earned, fought for, sacrificed for, calculated and achieved through impossible effort, that had a different quality, a weight and texture that shaped how he understood his own value and capability. He had not waited for someone to give him freedom. He had taken it, purchased it, earned it through the most extreme application of will, determination, and strategic patience that he could muster. Elijah lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in 1898, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all born free, all educated, all carrying forward the legacy of a man who had proven that even in the most oppressive system imaginable, human determination could calculate a path to liberation. His story became part of the family's oral history, passed down through generations as a reminder of what their ancestor had sacrificed, what freedom had cost, and why it must never be taken for granted. The old tin box that had held his accumulating freedom fund was preserved as a family heirloom, a tangible connection to a journey that transformed one man's impossible dream into a reality that inspired hundreds. In remembering Elijah's journey, we remember that freedom has always had a price, though the currency varies. For some, it was paid in blood on battlefields. For others, it was paid in the patient accumulation of knowledge and the strategic resistance of the mind. For Elijah, it was paid in 20-hour days multiplied by 1,000, in the destruction and rebuilding of his own body, in the support of a community that gave from poverty, and in the unwavering belief that he was worth $800, even when the law said he was worth nothing beyond his labor. His story teaches us that freedom is not just a condition, but an achievement, not just a right, but a responsibility, and that the greatest tribute we can pay to those who purchased, fought for, and died for freedom is to value it as dearly as they did, to use it as wisely as they dreamed, and to extend it as generously as they hoped. Elijah's freedom was hard-won, but it was also freely shared, multiplied through his efforts until one man's liberation became a pathway for dozens, then hundreds, then contributed to the ultimate liberation of millions. The mathematics of his sacrifice created an equation that still resonates today. Determination plus sacrifice plus community equals possibility. And possibility, however impossible it seems, is where freedom begins.